Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro, friends. I hope your day is going well. Today we're going to talk about harassment in the workplace and if it's possible to get rid of it out of the workplace. This is an extension of a discussion that I had with Samantha Ferretto on episode 51 or 52 of the podcast. I think it was 51 actually. And Samantha is a former psychologist who is turned coffee professional. She's a coffee roaster. And we spoke at length about sexual harassment in the workplace. And I want to talk today about not just sexual harassment, but harassment in general. And we will talk about the definition between the two different things. And we will explore the idea of how those things start to happen and how we can get rid of them in the workplace. So let's look at a couple of definitions before we start. So harassment is something that encompasses a wide variety of behaviors, but something that all kinds of harassment has in common is that it's demeaning, it's humiliating, and it's embarrassing to the person who's on the receiving end of the harassment. And it's identified by its likelihood in terms of social and moral reasonabilities. So harassment it's identified as harassment if by moral and social standards it is seen to be those things, right? Now, sexual harassment is defined by the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in Australia. And this is a lot of these definitions are much of a muchness amongst the different organisations that have them. And again, I'm reading off a script here about this definition because I want to make sure I get it right. It's unwelcomed sexual advances, requests for sexual favours, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment. When this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. That is sexual harassment. So as you can see, in both instances, whether it be of a sexual nature or of let's say a bullying nature, harassment is very uncomfortable, it's embarrassing, and it makes people feel uncomfortable. And more than anything, it's unwelcomed. So at the core of it, we have to understand that harassment is defined. For something to be harassment, it must be unwelcomed. So we're not talking about that where a bunch of people are standing around and they're all like roasting each other and it becomes like a bit too much. That's not harassment. Harassment is when it is unwelcomed behavior of a sexual or non-sexual nature. It leaves the person on the receiving end feeling horrible. And oftentimes, depending on the culture that you're in and depending on the nature of the person that's on the receiving end of it, mostly it's going to be from people who tend to be more agreeable in nature, because bullies don't pick on people who are likely to fight back. So, where does it start? What causes all of this? Through speaking to Samantha on the podcast, we came to realize, and she had done a lot of research before she came on the podcast to talk about this, harassment is a thing that starts in seemingly very benign behavior. So, for example, if somebody calls somebody, like if one of the guys in the workplace calls another one of the guys, like, stop being a pussy, or stop being a sissy. Sissy is something that we say in Australia. I'm not sure if it's something that's said here in the States, but sissy is the same kind of equivalent of stop being a pussy. The new research has shown that that is the seed behavior that then goes on to develop into a culture of sexual harassment. So when people figure out that they can say those things and get away with it, the majority of the time, that then evolves into a more toxic, potentially dangerous cultural environment within a workplace. Knowing this is where employers and employees in a work environment can start looking out for this behavior and start cutting it off at the knees when it starts. So it is, they call this behavior gender harassment. That's what it is. And that gender harassment is the one that evolves into systemic. If this culture is harnessed, if this culture is encouraged, if this culture is left untreated, it festers into a systematic culture within a workplace of sexual harassment. You now have heard this. If you're listening to this podcast, and I encourage you to share this information with people, because we have to figure out how to get this the fuck out of our industry, because it really exists in a lot of workplaces. This idea that we can start with the harmless gestures of calling this guy a pussy and calling her, stop being butch, and all this kind of little seemingly harmless attacks. If you are anyone in a leadership position in a cafe and you start seeing this kind of behavior and you don't cut it off at the knees when it happens and keep cutting it off at the knees every single time it happens, you are being complicit in encouraging a culture of this nature in your workplace. And this is where I want to start talking about why it's so important for business owners to be deliberate about defining the culture within their workplace. We talk about this a lot in our Map It Forward workshops when we're talking to business owners. A fundamental part of you setting up your business, a fundamental part of you evolving your business, is to define and continually redefine what the culture of your business is. What that looks like is you, as the owner, as the ship steerer of your company, trying to figure out and understand how you want people to feel when they work in and engage with your business. How do you want people to feel? How do you want people to treat each other? How do you want to be treated? What do you want people to experience having encountered and engaged your brand? All of the answers to those questions are going to be the things, the words, the answers that are going to feed how you want to define your culture. So as an example, for Elixir, we have the kind of culture where people are truthful, they speak truthfully, and you will never ever be in any way punished for anything. It is not a punishment environment, and I'm very anti this idea, you can get into trouble for something, but we are a staunchly boundaried business. And what that means is that I communicate what we expect from the people that work for this company, and we communicate the consequences of not meeting the standards and boundaries of what are set for you. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to be surprised when we assert those boundaries, when they've crossed over them, but it does mean that I am going to expect of me the same as that I expect of you, which is my truth, great communication, assertiveness, clarity, basically all our life currencies, because I want to cultivate wealth in our life currencies throughout my staff and set an example for that. So in the culture of our company, you don't get into trouble for anything. But if you cross boundaries, you do understand the consequences of those things. So for example, if you don't turn up to work and you haven't let anybody know that you are not coming to work, well, I am not going to put up with that shit. And you know well in advance that if you don't turn up to work one day and don't explain yourself or let somebody know, first thing I'm going to do is check on you. Second thing I'm going to do is fire you, because that is not a respectful way to treat your employees, and it's not a respectful way to treat me. I am here to support you. I am here to be as inspiring and as nurturing as I possibly can be as the ship steerer of this business. But I'm not here to mother you. I'm not here to parent you. You're a fucking adult. If you're meant to show up to work, show up to work. And so the thing is, those kinds of boundaries and having a clearly defined culture that way lets people know that you're also, if you are somebody who is a predator, if you are somebody who is likely to pick on other people, that shit will not stick in my businesses. And I will fuck you up if you try and do something like that to any of the co-workers in this business. And I'm an employee of this company the same way that anybody else is an employee of this company. And I will hold you accountable if you shit talk anybody in my business. So that is a way that I ensure that that kind of behavior never accelerates to something that will end up being a cultural thing. Cut it off at the knees. And that can sometimes be a difficult conversation to have. That's okay. Challenge yourself, step into the hard shit. And this is why I often say, being a business owner is going to teach you everything you never wanted to know about yourself. It's hard to accept that having these conversations is difficult for you sometimes, but step into it, do it. And the great reward for this is that you are creating a safe environment for people to exist in, for people to work in. Now, tomorrow on the Daily Coffee Pro, we're going to talk about some things that you can do if you are on the receiving end of harassment, whether it be sexual or otherwise in the workplace. On that note, peace, love and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day, friends. Take care.